How much can you learn about Formula One from reading a romance novel? Sports romance novels are not a new genre, but over the past few years in particular, we've seen an uptick of sports romance novels doing something really interesting. There has been a bit of a phenomenon of women in particular getting interested in sports through romance novels. I would say we've seen this happen the most when it comes to hockey. Hockey romance novels have continued to become incredibly popular on TikTok, and they're consistently popping out more and more and more. Like right now, if I pull out my phone and I go on Goodreads and I search hockey romance, you can see over 469 titles that come up, and to be honest, Goodreads is not the best search engine. For example, if you were to go on Amazon or Kindle Unlimited, you would actually see an extreme number of hockey romance books that come up. And it's not just hockey, like we have seen an uptick in all sports romance novels. There's even a soccer romance novel that's being adapted into a television show called Cleat Cute. There seems to be something really specific about using romance novels to teach you a little bit about the sport. I've actually come across a lot of friends who've asked me to take them to sports games after reading a romance novel for various sport. And then what I found was that a lot of these romance novels are actually pretty accurate, and if you read them, you will learn a little bit about the sport. And then I realized I wanted to find a way to make a list of books that if you did want to get into this sport, you would actually be able to learn a little bit about it. So I set out to start reviewing sports romance novels in a very different way. Instead of talking about whether I liked them or didn't, though I'm sure you'll probably be able to tell from my reviews, the goal with these book reviews will be to tell you how much you would learn about the sport in reading them. Whether this is the book that you should hand to a friend that you've been desperately trying to get to go to a race with you or a game, and if it will help you answer any of their basic questions that they usually would have. And because a lot of you know me from my Formula One content, when I asked people which books they'd like me to review, this was the one that came up the most: Throttled by Lauren Asher. Now, to be fair to this book, I'm gonna split my review into two sections. Section 1 will be the first 300 pages of the book, and the other section that we'll have to use as a little bit of a caveat will be the last 80 pages. First thing we should talk about is how much of this book is actually about Formula One, and whether or not it's just used as a setting or if it's actually integral to the story. Because I am someone who loves visual representation, on the side here you can see that I was tabbing the book while I was reading it. The blue tabs are the scenes that actually were on-track action or slightly related to getting ready to go on track or just off track. And the green tabs are scenes that had to do with like the business of Formula One. I made one big category for this because there were too many things that you could kind of lump together that also wouldn't have been its own significant category. So for example, if they were at like a fundraising event for a sponsor, that went into this category, but things like talking about their contracts also went into this category. Anything that sort of had to do with the business side of Formula One. That being said, one of the best parts about sports is the stats, so let's do a quick stats breakdown on this book. The book itself is about 380 pages, and about 51 of those pages are dedicated to on-track, pre- or post-track action. That means racing actually accounts for about 13.4% of this book. About 34 pages of the book would be slotted into that business of Formula One category that I talked about, which accounts for about 9% of the book, which means that in total, this book is about 22.4% about Formula One. To me, I will say that was more than I was expecting it to have. I think a lot of times romance novels have this thing where they use like a job or a profession as just sort of like an identifier. Like, this guy does business, this guy flies planes. And so there was a real possibility to me that this book could have just been like, oh, this guy drives Formula One cars, and that is sort of just, that's his archetype. He's a bad boy, he drives fast, that type of thing. Sort of just like using Formula One driver as an archetype to keep you from having to explain too much about this guy, or just sort of like a jumping off point, right? But I will say that with this book, Throttled, it does go towards the scale of couldn't have happened without Formula One. Or better yet, Formula One is integral to this romance taking place. So to that point, I think this book is very grounded in the idea of Formula One. Also, one thing to keep in mind for this book as we talk about it is that it was written in 2019. And for context on that, 2019 is actually the year that Drive to Survive premiered. So to be fair to this author, I do want to point out that there was maybe not as much of Drive to Survive or Formula One in the larger internet culture at that time. This author is also American, and I'm not sure how familiar she was with Formula One before deciding to write this book. Not to say that Americans can't know Formula One very well, as I am, here speaking to you. But I do think that timeline is important for the context of this review, because when we're looking at it now in 2024, we're thinking about it at the point that Formula One has really spread across America in a really big way, and also really taking on its own beast when it comes to the internet, when we talk about things like fandom spaces and all of that. So I think 2019 was an interesting year to write a Formula One romance, because it's probably one of the earlier ones that exist. And it exists without the added benefit of like the entire internet talking about Formula One constantly and being able to sort of immerse yourself in that space. And it also exists before there were a lot of women publicly facing in the fandom spaces. And so I think that that's important when we talk about this book, to keep that in mind. All of that being said, let's dive back into kind of how this book is laid out, because I think that was one of the more interesting parts. The book itself actually follows the entire Formula One season, the year that it's being written. The thing that is pretty cool about the book is that it does follow, I don't know if I can make this show up. It does follow the track. So a lot of the chapters will have these sort of pages where they show you the track itself, where we are, and how we're following that circuit. But how well does Lauren Asher actually show you the way that a Formula One weekend works? Again, the 2019 caveat is going to come up here, obviously, because this was written pre-2021. The sprint format is not included in this book. So every race weekend is just, a normal race weekend. If you read this book without ever knowing anything about Formula One prior to, by the end, you would know that a race weekend has practice sessions, though you probably wouldn't know how many there are. You would know that there's a qualifying session, and obviously you would know that there's a race itself. You would also know that there are 2 drivers on every team, and that sometimes those drivers don't like each other. So in terms of getting the basics of the world, technically, yes, I think you would understand the format of a race weekend, at least just enough to be able to understand what people are talking about when they're saying it to you, or at least understand that a race weekend is not just the race that you show up to and go to, but that there are actual steps to it. I will say that in this book, one of my biggest complaints was the fact that the vocabulary is just slightly left of correct. For example, there's a lot of references to drivers calling qualifying the qualifier, which is obviously not a huge complaint, but it did feel a little off, and it did continue to take me out of the world. But again, if you didn't know anything about Formula One, I don't know that it would bother you, and you would learn the correct term later on. Ultimately, I would give the vocabulary in this book a B-. It's enough that you would understand what someone was talking about when they were using the correct words, but it's enough that would also kind of put you in a position where you might use the wrong words moving forward. But again, close enough that if you're trying to just get someone into this story and get someone into the sport, it's enough. It's enough of a basics, right? We can also talk about the setup of this book, because I think it's good in some ways, and in other ways it's a bit unbelievable. But sometimes finding true love feels a little bit unbelievable, and that's okay. Sometimes there's a requirement for a suspension of disbelief. Tropes-wise, the book utilizes sort of a brother's enemy instead of brother's best friend situation. Our main players are Maya, who is 23 and has just graduated college, doesn't know what she wants to do in life, but conveniently has an older brother who is a Formula One star. Her older brother has just signed a contract with a team that he caused to crash the season prior to, and his teammate is, the guy he crashed into, already setting up a lot of tension, a lot of enemies energy, and obviously a little bit of a forbidden love. Because the teammate that he crashed into previously, his name is Noah, and that is our love interest. Noah is American, a 3-time world champion, and working his way up to another. That being said, there are a couple of other things that you'll learn about when it comes to Formula One from these characters, mainly the idea of a team principle. I did kind of feel like there was a bit of a missed opportunity to have learned more about the other people that are involved in the sport, since we're getting half of this book from the perspective of the driver. So for example, we don't really learn anything about his engineer or his pit crew or his trainer or anything else like that from either Noah or from Santiago, the brother. We do find out that there's a team principal, and we do meet him a couple of times, and that's an interesting way to kind of bring that idea into the story. But in terms of team dynamics, this book is really going to just show you the drivers, the team principal as almost kind of like a father figure, and the dynamics with a couple of the other drivers on the grid and how that works. So in terms of team dynamics, you're going to learn basically that. There are 2 drivers, there's a team principal, there are other people involved, but we don't really get to meet them. We also get this idea of a Formula One influencer, which again, this book was written in 2019, and I think that was kind of before there was a large amount of those. But Maya specifically sort of becomes a Formula One influencer, half by accident, half on purpose. Again, this works for most of the book and feels pretty accurate in some cases, but in other cases feels super inaccurate, mostly because there's a level of access that I don't think she would have. There are a number of points where she's inside the car filming things from inside the car and posting those online. She's filming in the garage, she's filming throughout the entire race. She has kind of unfettered access to all of the drivers whenever she wants. But there are a couple of mentions of the idea that she's, getting this all approved through the team. Knowing a little bit about that side of the world, I would say that there's a large amount of access that she gets that I can't see really being believable, but it is an interesting way to kind of give her a job inside the world as opposed to just having her follow her brother and future boyfriend around as well. So I liked the agency that it creates for this character and the ability to kind of get to see what their personalities would look like, and maybe there's a way to kind of rectify it in my head, right? And the suspension of disbelief just comes from the amount of access that she's given and the amount of sort of trade secrets that the team would allow her to be posting about, just direct video of. But it gives us an opportunity to have a fun way to meet some of the other drivers that we know will have romance books later on in the series and things like that. If I were to assign an MVP of this book in terms of not one of the characters that fall in love, it would go to Sophie, who is the team principal's daughter and also the best friend to Maya. Very much integral in their relationship becoming a thing and is kind of a fun way to get a little glimpse into what it's like to be the daughter of a team principal. And if we were to assign a least valuable player in this book, it would absolutely be Maya's brother, Santiago. If you like the older brother trope, this may not bother you, but there are a number of things that happen in this book where they are like actively blocked by Santiago's existence and his also like kind of obsession with his younger sister. And while I have no problem with a loving sibling relationship, I did think it was a little weird that with like millions of dollars underneath his contract, they never seem to get their own hotel rooms. And that does become like a part of the plot. Now, one of the things that people asked when I asked what they wanted me to include in this review was like who each character represented on the current grid. And what I will say is I actually think she does a really good job of not making this like a one-to-one copy paste of current Formula One drivers. Lauren did take the time to create her own characters that have their own backstory, and while some of it may sound kind of familiar to little tidbits of drivers that we're really familiar with, none of it felt like I could say, oh, this character is just a copy paste version of this driver or this WAG or something like that. She made up her own team names, she made up her own concept with those teams, which ones were family owned, which ones were not. While I always would love more detail or love to dive a little bit more into that world, the fact that they are their own things, I actually really enjoyed. Personally, I don't love when books feel like they just sort of copy pasted a driver from the grid into their story, and this one doesn't feel that way. Definitely moments where you're like, oh, this kind of feels familiar from this person's backstory or things like that, but I think that's just a general concept of sports and building your own character in them. For example, there are moments where the team that these guys drive for, Bandini, feels like it's maybe a replica of Ferrari, but then there are other times where you're listening to the kind of team dynamic and the fact that it feels more like a family-owned business, and that feels a little bit more like Williams in the early days. Lauren Asher really took her time to build her own characters in this universe, and I don't really feel like she said, like, let me take Max Verstappen and put him in a romance novel, or let me take Daniel Ricciardo and put him in a romance novel. And that could be really easy and simple. But I think she did a good job of building her own characters and building a narrative around them. And to me, that's a plus. I wouldn't necessarily have been comfortable reading a book that felt like it was an exact replica of a real person. Maya herself also feels like a fully developed character, not one that is kind of built off of an existing person or anything like that. And so overall, that was a big plus to me. So let's talk about the accuracy of this book. My overall answer to that is if you didn't know anything about Formula One, I think you would learn a couple of things and then you would need to unlearn a couple of the things that you learned. Overall, I think you would learn the format of a race weekend. You would learn kind of the format of how these drivers travel and how many races there are throughout the year. You would get an idea of sort of like the amount of money that these guys make, how team dynamics work, the idea of like press conferences, how those get turned into sound bites, some of the feel of racing action, I would say, though it's not 100% accurate when you are looking at sort of like timing, speed, and how they would be discussed in that way. And then other than some like overall vocabulary things that weren't just exactly accurate, I think you would learn sort of just like the basic concept of Formula One weekends. I think this is like a book that you could give one of your friends that are really, really reluctant to get into Formula One or even kind of like have a conversation with you to be sort of like, look at how like sexy and fun this sport could be. And then after that, I think you would need to give them something else to learn before really pushing them into the racing itself. Because there are a number of things that just like are glossed over, right? That aren't necessarily super important for the plot of the book, but would be important to understand what's going on. One of the things that I think starts to get explained at the beginning of the book is the idea that there are two different championships that we're competing for the entirety of the Formula One season. There's the individual drivers championship as well as the team championship, which is called the constructors championship. And that is explained at the beginning of the book, but the idea of points, how they're acquired, how many you get, and where the standing was throughout the whole season is really not there. We get sort of like quick examples that like this team behind them is catching up, or this driver behind them is catching up, or the idea that the two of them are competing, but the point spread doesn't really make sense throughout the book. It's not really like a focus, which is fine. It's a romance novel. It's not necessarily about the numbers or the statistics, but when the tension comes from the idea that these drivers are so close to winning, I would have liked to have had a little bit more of an idea of where they were in the point standings or how many points away. I think would have been a good idea to both help you learn about the sport itself and like the idea of point standings, but also just to keep you in the loop with the book and where we were at, because throughout they're pretty much like accepting that they're basically at the top of the grid the entire season, despite some crashes, some different things that happen that keep them from being in the top of the points the whole time. So you would definitely still need to explain the idea of points and how the points work to someone who had just read this book and wanted to learn more about Formula One. The other big inaccuracy in this book that was a little bit hard to watch was the idea of team radio. At the beginning of this review, I said to be fair to this book, I really feel like I have to split it between the first 300 pages drives in the last 80 pages. So for the first 300 pages, my review is if you know nothing about Formula One, you will pick up some of the basics from this book, and then you will probably still need to Google, watch Drive to Survive, watch some documentaries, ask some questions, but it's enough to get you interested. The last 80 pages take a creative liberty that was a little hard to get my hands around. The one thing that this book gets really wrong is the idea of team radio. If you watch Formula One already, or you are just aware of Formula One from like internet memes, I'm pretty sure you're aware of the idea of team radio. If you're not, basically every driver can talk to their team engineer throughout the entire race, and they're being given important information on the race itself, their competitors, people behind them, people in front of them, lap times, tire degradation, all of these different things that are really important to the concept of the race itself and being able to win it. Now, this book opens up on a race itself, and team radio in that section is pretty inaccurate because there are a lot of people on the radio with the driver. Generally speaking, there's just going to be the team's engineer, and every once in a while you might hear a team principal chime in, and that is usually if it's like an important call that needs to be made to tell a driver to focus, to give team orders, which might be two drivers swapping places, etc. So the opening scene being on track action was really great, I thought, because you're diving right into the sport, you're getting someone interested into the most exciting part, and I was kind of willing to overlook the fact that there are too many people on the radio, too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. This is one of the things that if you're already pretty familiar with Formula One, you might be a little irritated by in the book. But to me, I actually thought it was not something that I was like, oh, I can't read this book anymore. It's so inaccurate, whatever. It's the type of thing that you can sort of, from a story perspective, let go. But then we get to those last 80 pages, and if you are someone who does not want any spoilers at all, I would say pause the video and skip a couple minutes ahead. The grand romantic moment of this book requires the driver on track to speak to his girlfriend on the radio. This is during the final race of the season. The World Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship are both up for grabs, and Noah needs to pass a driver ahead of him. However, he recently crashed and is still struggling to deal with that mentally. So he demands that his girlfriend be put on the radio. Well, I understood the gesture. I really did. I understand romance. I understand big moments, right? But in terms of the sport itself, if you are even vaguely familiar with Formula One, this is a scene that is going to pull you completely out of the book. And I think part of that is because the author herself chooses to sort of hang a hat on how ridiculous this is by having the team principal say, like, I'll pay the fines, don't worry about it, by like really harping on that conversation, and then later saying that it turns into this viral moment because the team radio is public. And that is also a little unbelievable, knowing Formula One's fan base too well. The thing that was so frustrating about this scene in the last 80 pages is that if it hadn't been for this scene, I would probably be telling you right now, like, yes, use this to get your friends interested enough to start the conversation. And to be honest, you could still do that, and I think that you just have to know that you're going to have to suspend your disbelief when you get to this point. But it's also the scene that would make me say, if you are already a fan of Formula One and you think that factual inaccuracies will take you out of the book, this is one to skip. So on a scale of like 1 to 10, how much would you learn about this book if you knew nothing about a Formula One? I'd give you like, a basic 5. You're not going to learn everything. You will get a feel for the world, and you will still need to kind of research afterwards. In terms of who this book is for, it's definitely for people who have no context for Formula One at all and are hoping to get maybe just like a taste of it to see if they're interested in it moving forward. I don't think this book is for people who would get taken out of a book from inaccuracies. Even just like little vocabulary inaccuracies, I think would be a struggle for people who are pretty familiar with the world. For example, I probably would have had the drivers use the word quali instead of qualifier, which is not accurate. There are little things with team radio, with standings, with moments that happen on track that aren't exactly believable. So would I recommend this book to someone who's already familiar with the world of Formula One, is a fan of it, and is just looking for a romance set in that world? I don't think so. Unless you are not someone that is bothered by little things like that. If you're fine with the suspension of disbelief and you go into it knowing that there's going to be a little bit of suspension of disbelief required and that certain things are not going to be 100% accurate, then that's fine. And you'll probably enjoy this book if you're just looking for sort of a forbidden romance type of situation. I think you could definitely use this book to get a friend into Formula One and to start the conversation. And I think that might be the most important part when we're looking for things like that. So all in all, I think if you have a friend who is really, really resistant to the idea of getting into Formula One, you could probably start with this. Just be ready to help them get into the sport after the fact. My overall takeaway from this is that this book, Throttled by Lauren Asher, is definitely a book to utilize to give someone like a taste test. Sort of like if you were out to dinner and you were trying to get someone to order a bottle of wine with you and you were like, let's get a little taster of this one I think you might like. It's not enough to really make you want to down the whole bottle, but it is enough to make you consider purchasing one and splitting it with a friend. So that being said, I'd love to know if you have already read Throttled, if you agree with those things, if you were hung up on the same things I was hung up on, or if you, like many of the people in my comment sections when I asked for recommendations for sports romances for this series, started watching Formula One because of this book, because that is something that I saw a lot of people say. And I think that's great. So I do think that this book can be used for that purpose. For this series, I will be covering all types of sports. So if there is a specific romance novel that you would like me to review in the same way, please drop it down in the comments below and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, I have been Marissa, and I hope that you will fall in love with Formula One and other sports through this romance series with me.